Again, thank you for joining this webinar today. This webinar is being recorded and we will share the contents with you in due course, so you can share that with your colleagues and partners. We also appreciate you'll have comments and questions, so please do feel free to use the chat box on the screen, and we'll endeavour to answer those questions at the end of the session. During the session, we'll have 3 short polls to go with our main questions, so if you could participate in those, we'd be very grateful. And at the end, there will be a short survey, and if you feel comfortable, we'd welcome your participation in that. This webinar is scheduled to take about 45 minutes, could be less or more depending on the questions. So let me introduce myself. I'm Ashley Whittaker, President of Sales here at FundCount, and we are of course a worldwide leader in delivering unified accounting and investment analysis software for family offices. Aside from building software and implementing it, one of the biggest things we do at FundCount is actually help potential clients to manage the risk of a procurement. So we have many decades of experience in this area, and to discuss this with me today, I'm very pleased to be joined by James Haluszczak. I hope I got that right, James. From yes. Excellent, first time for everything. From SteelBridge Consulting, and I'm very interested to hear his point of view as a consultant dealing with multiple software vendors and obviously many organisations as well. So James, could I ask you just to give a short introduction to SteelBridge and yourself, please?
Yeah, and first of all, Ashley, thank you for having me on the panel. I'm pleased to join you in talking about this important topic. So yes, James Haluszczak, you got that correct. Well done. And I'm the managing partner and founder of SteelBridge Consulting. We're a boutique consultancy focused within the private capital markets. Our range of services extend from everything specific to this topic, which is software selection, implementation, and ensuring that that goes successfully, all the way through to technology services in helping our clients integrate that technology within their technology stack, migrate data, ensure processes accurate using that technology, and so forth. So, as I said, pleased to be on the panel.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining me today. This is intended to be a discussion format, so please do ask any questions as James and I are talking through these topics. So our first topic is how to avoid a long and costly procurement process. And we have a short poll that we'll ask you to partake in now. And the question is, what procurement methodologies have you used in the past? I think you can answer as many as you feel are relevant. Just give everybody 20 seconds to complete that. That feels like it should be about 20 seconds. And Abby, have you got the results there for us?
I am waiting for the results here as they're compiled.
Nail biting.
It is nail biting. Okay, here we go. It looks like the majority of people say peer recommendation has been what they've used in the past, 88%, followed next by a tie between RFI and RFPs and the deep dive or high-level demos. So those are the top 3 procurement methodologies.
Excellent, thank you for that. So bearing that in mind as we go through, thank you for everybody for answering. Our first question then, how to avoid a long and costly procurement. At FundCount, we participate in a lot of procurement processes, obviously, and they're generally focused around functionality. And that's a real challenge, I think, we see, because obviously the potential clients are trying to learn 3 or 4 different systems at once, more in some cases. And it's our experience that those sorts of solely functionally focused procurement processes perhaps don't achieve the right results in terms of, especially in terms of expense and time. So James, I was wondering what sort of best approaches you'd seen to procurement over your consulting career.
Yeah, and actually, I'm not surprised one bit by the results of that poll, in that while there were a couple that sort of, jumped to the top, for the most part, as you looked at that poll, it was pretty much across the board. And that, as I said, that's not surprising. There is no silver bullet or specific answer to what do we need to do to avoid, the costly procurement process. I think the biggest thing is to recognize what you're getting into and understand that you're taking on a project, if you will, that will consume resources, and that's both dollars and people's time. And knowing that going into it is the most important point. I think preparedness is critical. I think we all get that, again, through the responses we saw, the RFI, RFP process. That is one approach that we've been involved in and worked with our clients on. I think more importantly than specifically putting an RFP out there is preparedness in that writing down what your expectations are as an outcome of implementing the software is the most critical point. And getting buy-in into that outcome top to bottom within the organization. So while the leaders are going to make the decision on implementing or selecting and then ultimately implementing, you've got the line folks or line resources that are going to be actually doing the implementation. And everyone needs to buy into that outcome or that overall objective. I think that is probably the most important point, regardless of the approach that you take for selecting the actual software. I think that is number one that I would highlight. I think related to some of the specific items, and actually, I'm not sure if we're going to get into POCs and so forth as a follow-on question, so maybe I should hold the comment I was about to make for you to carry on. But again, most important point is going into this prepared, knowing what your requirements are and what your outcome and objectives are, and making sure that you're aware that it's going to take resources, both time and money, and in often cases, it's going to be expensive in both areas.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's quite a large number of procurement processes we're involved with where the prospect doesn't necessarily know what they want out of the system. They're so focused on what the system should do that very often it comes to something like reporting, which is, of course, arguably the end goal. And prospects are not necessarily able to tell us what they want. Is that been a common experience for you, or is it just FundCount that's lucky in that respect?
No, you're absolutely right. I would even go as far as saying the system does more than you will ever need. And that's a broad statement across all the different investment accounting applications that we're involved in, of course, including FundCount. The system likely does everything that you can think of and that you're going to put on a piece of paper. And so thinking about the nuances of each feature within the application will get you into a bit of analysis paralysis. While it's important to understand the features and to make sure that you're clear that the application can meet certain goals, again, those end goals you need to set out, getting into the details of every single one of the line item features, I think, again, will get you into analysis paralysis. Rather than doing that, you just mentioned it, Ashley, the outcome is better data control, improved efficiency, being able to report to the downstream constituents, whether it's internal or external constituents, the information that you are putting into the system. Those are your end goals, and making sure that the system is able to accomplish that end goal in a manner that is appealing to you as an individual user or your user team is the most critical point that I would highlight.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I do wonder whether that lack of lack of understanding of what the end goal is might actually be derived from a lack of understanding of the data ecosystem that many people are operating in. Now, we see that in a very high level way when people are asking us, well, have you got predetermined data feeds to custodians and banks? And they just, I think there's an expectation now with data being so freely available that these things can just be dropped into your lap. I'm not sure that's true. I don't know whether you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, a number of systems like yours have integrations with other data platforms. So they're available. It's not as easy as just turning it on like you just described. It's technology, and things do break when data is being fed. Understanding the let's get into the weeds here. Understanding the actual file format of data coming out of one data provider versus another data provider, getting that into the system, and then ultimately having it flow through the system that you selected and come out in reports is a complex process. So. Yeah. To your point about understanding data, it's yes, we need to understand it, but it's also going through line by line with regards to the data feeds that you're looking to pull into the system, and making sure there's clarity all the way through that sort of chain of data flow in that process. So it is a complex process, even though you can say, look, I do have connectivity to Bloomberg as an example. It's not just that easy to say, oh yeah, we'll just go grab that Bloomberg data. What data do you want from Bloomberg? How do you want to process that data in the system? How do you want to report on that data ultimately on the back end of the process is complex.
Yeah. And to go back to your earlier point, you mentioned proof of concepts. Do you think they're really valuable, or are they just going to add time and expense?
Yeah. So I'm looking back at the poll here, and it's, as I said in the beginning when that poll first came out, I'm not surprised that everyone is sort of looking at it differently. I have mixed feelings on POCs. In some cases, I think for smaller or even small middle market, if you will, managers or investors, sometimes they may be overkill. I think the demo process is probably going to be sufficient, where you're looking at the system and making sure that you feel your team can leverage that application appropriately to solve the objective that you're trying to solve. Taking it a step further and putting your data, or asking the vendor to put your data in there and do a POC is often overkill in those cases, for the reason that it's usually only a subset of data. And if we're talking a week of POC, we're not really doing the configuration that would be required within the application to appropriately give you the end results you may be looking for. So in those cases, I would say probably not valuable. If you're a larger investor or fund manager, that could be a little bit of a different story, because you have probably a technology ecosystem that requires data integrations, not only from data sources, but to other downstream systems within your environment. So perhaps putting data into the application, taking a longer time for a POC, could be valuable for that type of manager or investor. So it really depends on the scenario, and that's where sitting down with knowledgeable resources on the vendor side, as well as potentially third parties, could be a valuable addition to that early stage of a project, to understand what is the best way for us to assess the technology that we may be implementing. Is it a POC? Is it an RFP? Is it just peer recommendations? What is the answer there? And again, I don't think there is one silver bullet. It's figuring out what's best for the particular situation.
So if I was to round up this part of the conversation, I've heard you correctly. I think it's very easy to concentrate on the tools of evaluation as being the end goal in itself, and that's probably not wise and not the case. So is there any sort of tool you would recommend for bringing that all together and making sure that these various options are used in their proper place to best effect?
Yeah, well, being a consultant, we like to use the word operational roadmap. We like to use the word strategic data management. I mean, the bottom line is look at your organization holistically, understand what your overall technology and data objectives are, and start walking in that path. This project is one piece of a puzzle which is multi-year, is going to be costly, but it's also going to institutionalize you as an organization. So again, looking at it broadly and really setting your objectives and setting the multi-year plan is probably that tool that I would recommend to everybody. And it's a worthwhile exercise to sit down and use the resources, both time and money, to make sure you're clear on that.
Yeah, and it sounds like it would be proper corporate governance to do so as well, in terms of succession planning and everything else, but that's a topic for another day. Okay, well, thank you for that. It was very interesting. So our second topic, we'll move on to that, is what resources to marshal before an implementation to ensure success. And I think we have another poll here. And I think the question is, what are your perceived success factors?
So let's give everyone a minute or two to answer this. What factors do you perceive most impact success? You could select one or more than one. Okay, why don't you finish up making your selection, and we'll start tallying the results. Okay, waiting another second here till the results come through. And here we go. This one's a little bit closer. We have a tie again for number one. So the project management, ERP implementation skills, and the dedicated project staff are the two factors that really impact success, followed closely by accounting experience. The vendor implementation methodology and the outside consultants seem to play a much lesser role.
Thank you, Abby. That's certainly very interesting, because I think that ties up with our experience, certainly, where we've seen the most successful implementations. It's been where the client has had very strong project management skills internally, and that ERP and accounting experience. Does that reflect your experience, James? All right, have we lost James, or are you on mute?
Thank you. I'm unmuted. I was clicking the unmute and it was not unmuting. Although when I started talking, I was on mute for the poll, so that was my fault, but I couldn't unmute it. So apologies, everybody.
I always wanted to do stand-up comedy, so I was about ready to go into it.
Yeah. That's funny. It could certainly work here. Anyhow, what I was about to say and what I was saying before I realized I was on mute was that the response to the poll is exactly what I would expect. Dedicated staff, making sure that there's implementation experience. And what we say to our clients when we're going through implementation projects or selection projects is, internally within the organization, again, there needs to be agreement in the objective top to bottom in the organization. But there also needs to be a champion for the project, meaning you can't hire external consultants, you can't rely on the vendor. You need to have somebody within the organization who's going to shepherd this through and be involved from the selection all the way through to final implementation, and most importantly, user adoption. So that is the one thing that we say is absolutely critical. And based on what we just saw in the poll results there, I think you all agree.
Yeah. I suppose one of the challenges of those poll results is, they stand to reason, but within a small organization where you might only have, 2 or 3 individuals managing the family office, and there's the day job to do, that is of itself quite a strain. how I mean, obviously you're a consultant, but you know, how do you see consultants fitting in and filling that gap for clients?
Well, I'll let my ego not be bruised by the fact that external consultants was last in that poll, but no, joking aside, the reality is in some cases that's a necessary, I'll call it evil. It is a necessary evil. And as you just described, you don't necessarily have the resources internally within your organization to make that happen. And so you may need to rely on somebody external to help you out. And, you know, it can be a firm like ours, which is a larger firm that has, you know, decades of experience in doing this. Or you can find, you know, an independent who will probably come in and be more cost effective, but has implementation experience, is familiar with the products that you're looking at. But having somebody dedicated is the most important point. And if you don't have it internally within your organization, I highly recommend finding somebody who is a resource that you can have on your side, or at least be an intermediary to help you be successful. So I do think that outside consultant situation is something that needs to be addressed at that point.
Yeah, and obviously one of the reasons that may not get addressed effectively is budget. You know, I think one of the interesting things we see is that over the last, maybe year or two, there's been a shift and a focus away from the sort of understanding and delving into the license fees and much more towards the cost of implementations themselves. And if I talk to many consultants out there, they'd argue that, you know, you should be expecting 1 to 3 times the annual recurring fee as a consulting fee to get a system implemented. Would you concur with that? How have you had budgetary conversations with clients or potential clients in the past around that sort of sticky money issue?
Yeah, I would concur. I mean, we're implementing complex software to manage a complex business. Like, we need to go into the project knowing that. We're not simply implementing a QuickBooks that, you know, literally anybody in the world can manage. We're implementing something that, you know, has elements of accounting information, has elements of portfolio information, has elements of LP and investor information, has data feeds from underlying source systems, potentially is then feeding information downstream to other systems, certainly is going to have some reporting and complex reporting elements coming out of either that system or some sort of reporting console that you may have in your organization. So what I just described there is very complex. Making sure that you select the right system, implement and configure that system appropriately, and then migrate data, which is an extremely important point, that you may think is clean, but when you start looking at it top to bottom and putting it into one source of truth, recognize it may not be clean. That is a complex process. And then you've got to build reports and so forth. So my point is when you think about everything that I just described there, it's a lot of work that needs to happen. So it's just a factor of time. It's going to take months to do that, likely. And generally speaking, working with the vendor or a third-party consultant who has experience is going to cost money to make that happen. Even if you were to use internal resources, there's still dollars behind that. As you said, Ashley, those resources have a day job, and implementing a system like this will require them to have a night job as well. And so there's going to be cost associated to either allocating those resources to additional work, or maybe hiring a resource to come in and help you make that happen. So yeah, it certainly is something that needs to be considered.
And do you think those budgetary challenges, when they come to organisations like SteelBridge and FundCount, do you think they exist because of that, if you like, that lack of potential planning, that lack of a roadmap, lack of an understanding of what the outcomes are and what their value to the organisation is?
Yeah, I would think that is a factor. I think we all recognize that there's going to be value by creating a single source of truth, assuming that everybody adopts the platform and uses it and trusts the platform to run the business, if you will, and ultimately report on that information. And so I think when you have buy-in top to bottom that this is the source of truth and we're going to use it, then you'll be able to recognize the value. I think the issue is there are too many situations, and this goes back to the peer sort of recommendations. There are too many situations where we say, okay, let's go ahead and implement, and we do, and we spend a year and we finally get data into the system, and all of a sudden somebody doesn't buy in, or a group of people don't buy into it. And so now they don't believe in the system. And so there's that frustration that, oh, we spent all of this time and money implementing a process, but it doesn't work. When or a system, and it doesn't work, and a process, frankly. When the reality is it's because there were breakdowns along the way. And so going back to the point about having the champion of the project, if you will be the person that ensures that everybody buys in along the way. And if there is something that isn't working with the data migration into the system, we solve the problem then versus shoehorning the data into the application, thereby rendering bad results in reporting down the road. And so, I think the reality is we just need to understand that we've got to buy into it. It's not going to be easy. It is going to cost a decent amount of money to make that happen. But if we stay on top of it along the way, we'll ultimately be able to achieve the objective that we set out to achieve down the road.
Yeah. And here's a question with an answer that's possibly as long as a piece of string. But we've mentioned this a number of times now. Even small family offices can be quite complex. But assuming an average size family office, whatever that is, and an average size level of complexity, what's the typical duration of projects that you see? What should people be expecting?
Yeah, I think, to be quite honest, for a complex investment accounting application, which has a bunch of other capabilities around it, 6 months minimum is what you're looking at. And that is from the moment you select. You could spend 6 months selecting if you had the energy to do that. But I think going into this and saying, I've selected the application, I am going to start the project, I'm going to do our design, configuration, implementation, data migration, testing, report building, and ultimately go live, minimum 6 months in my mind. I think you would be best to budget a year. And if you are a complex family office with expectation for data to flow from underlying source systems, you have complex assets, maybe non-traditional assets that you want to manage within the application that require some configuration and maybe even some unique reporting capabilities, looking at 18 months to 24 months would not be unreasonable. So that may be a little jarring for people, and that's the entire objective of this webinar, where this is complex stuff, and we want to make sure that people understand, looking at 6 months to up to 2 years on doing some sort of implementation like this is reality. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting when people compare FundCount implementations to other organizations that perhaps are reporting only solutions. That's maybe a quarter of what FundCount is. So yeah, you're essentially implementing a number of systems at the same time. With the benefit of that single source of truth at the end of it, but it's it's not necessarily a painless process.
Yeah. Now let me qualify that. If you're a brand new family office and you have no historical data that you want to put in, different story. That is a different story. I mean, you could probably implement FundCount in a couple months, and we're ready to roll. And here we go. Let's start using the system. And as a matter of fact, we're starting with a greenfield, so there are no bad processes that we've created that we need to now replicate in FundCount. That's a different story. It's when you have historical data. That's the biggest piece of the puzzle. Data and reporting, those are the two most complex challenges. When you have that, and data integrations, I should say, when you have those three elements, that's when you start extending the timeline.
Yeah, great. All right, well, thank you for that. Very interesting. So our third and final question is how to establish the right commercial and practical implementation processes. And we have a final question. Perhaps you'd let us know what that is, Abby.
Yep, the question is, in the last 10 years, have you been involved in a procurement process that did not lead to a system purchase? And this is an easy yes, no. So please let us know if you've been involved in a project or not. We'll give folks A little bit of time here, but it's an easy question, so we'll see how it comes through.
Oh, that's great. Let's see what the answers are.
Do we need a drum roll, Ashley?
I still want to do my comedy pitch.
Okay. All right, look at this. Far and away, it looks like the majority of people have been involved in a process that did not lead to a system purchase. So I'll let you take it from here, Ashley and James.
Thank you. Well, I don't suppose that surprises me. I think the vast majority of procurement processes that FundCount gets involved with do not produce a purchase solution. I think for many of the reasons we've discussed in the course of this webinar, maybe that's because of a lack of understanding of what the final outcome should be. But I also have a strong opinion that actually in looking at the software and focusing on functionality and ignoring the outcomes, that people are actually ignoring the real risk in a procurement, which is the implementation itself, and perhaps not spending enough time looking at that as an issue, which obviously when you start to do something as practical as that forces you down the road of organising yourself and the roadmaps and et cetera that you've talked about, James. What's your view on that? Yeah,
the implementation is actually, in my mind, when the real work begins. It is the most complex part of the project, and I described all the phases, but the very beginning of the implementation, designing and configuring the system to meet the needs of the objective and the outcome of the system is critical. Back to the poll results, I'm not surprised by that as well. It's in line with what we've seen. I think a big reason why that occurs is you do recognize once you start getting into this selection process that it is going to be a complex project, and maybe now's not the best time to do it. So, let's push it off for a little while. Maybe you recognize that the costs are going to be substantial and meaningful, and so again, maybe now's not the time to do it, so we push it off. But I think it's going back to, as you said, Ashley, understanding what you're really trying to get out of it and why you began that selection process, and committing to achieving the goal that you are trying to achieve. And once you commit to that, then you jump in with both feet and you make it happen. So, just knowing that the real work's going to begin, there's going to be a period of time that there's going to be a heavy lift on all resources, including potentially external resources that you're working with, especially the vendor. But ultimately, you'll have an environment where, again, you have your single source of truth, you have easier access to data that you're more confident in, and knowing that as is going to be the outcome is important and something to stay focused on.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that we've recognised that the procurement processes may not necessarily be, if you like, that work may not be translatable into the final implementation and product. And I think POCs are a great example of that, where you can end up with a lot of detailed work that essentially isn't reusable. And one of the ways we've addressed that challenge at FundCount is to, regardless of size, is to insist more and more on a fully fledged business analysis phase at the start of a project, so that if there are any deficits in terms of the procurement process, those are, at least stand a chance of being resolved as we move into the implementation. It sounds a pretty basic and practical, sensible approach, but it's interesting how many organizations just want to actually start playing with the software straight away. That's the first thing they want to do. What's your experience been?
Yeah, it's mixed. I think it really depends on size and complexity of the client. I think smaller clients are more akin to just give me the software and let's start playing with it, because we see that with Salesforce, or we see that again with a QuickBooks as an example. And those are probably systems that have been used within these organizations. I think without having the proper business analysis phase in place, which is a phase that many smaller investors, or I'm sorry, larger investors or larger fund managers go through, without putting that process in place, you may not uncover some of these challenges related to your data, related to what reporting do you really need, that you would uncover in a business analysis phase or configuration design phase. So we think it's important, and we always recommend it, even if it's a short-term phase. That this doesn't need to be 3 months of the project. It can be a couple of weeks of the project, but making sure that a decent amount of time is dedicated during that short-term phase is critical. Now, that phase can be up to a third of your project. That's reality. It could be, depending on how complex you are as an organization. But going through whatever the length of time is in BA in the beginning is critical in our minds. And we frankly, we wouldn't do a project with a client without having that done, because there is no good result that comes out of just implementing the software, trying to migrate data, and then say, why is this not working?
Yeah. And sort of following on from that, do you see pilots as being a useful part of an implementation process, or are they a distraction?
No, we do. We actually do. This is something that I feel strongly about. And I pilot is a fine word to use, just like POC and the selection process is a fine word to use. I actually look at it a little differently, and we simply call it phasing the implementation. Taking some of the simpler functions or data sets that you have in your organization and getting them into the system is what we found to be the approach that leads to the highest chance of success for you as an individual organization. And the reason for that is fairly obvious, I think, in that, when you have simpler things that you're putting into a complex piece of software that is brand new to your organization, there's a higher likelihood that people will understand it and therefore adopt it. If you put in something that is complex and legacy data that, is in 50 Excel files from, 2005, you're just asking for opening a can of worms that you don't want to open, frankly. And so phasing the approach to implementation, we think, is critical. The first phase, if you want to call it pilot, is totally fine, and there could be some commercial success factors or criteria associated to that you can work with the vendor on. But I think it's just taking that approach of a bite-sized piece of information or process or data and putting it into the product is a good way to go. So long answer to pilot, I think, is something that is reasonable and something that we would recommend, again, given the scenario. If it's a newer client, different story. If it's a legacy complex client that's putting it into a very complex technology stack, maybe that's a little bit of a different story as well.
Yeah. And I think, just to close this section, I think it's behoving on clients to take a very practical approach to this and be very strategic about how they're managing that process. I've seen large family offices decide that they're going to reconcile historic data down to a 1 cent materiality level after 15 years of investing in a particular asset, and the difference is $10 on a $1 million investment. To my mind, spending time going into that is just crazy. But horses for courses.
Yeah, and Ashley, you bring up a good point. I think there is a reasonableness factor that everybody should step back and understand. Look, we're working with accountants day in and day out. I have an accounting mindset, just like many folks on the phone here. We want to make sure we are 100% spot on. And look, I've been in the middle of these projects cleaning up that data. What I've learned in the 23 years of doing this is there needs to be a reasonableness factor. Otherwise, costs just exponentially balloon, and people at the end of the day are frustrated on every end of the project and of the implementation. So whatever that reasonableness factor is within your organization, I think it's something that in that BA phase you talk about and you make decisions on, so that when you come across this information and these reconciliation items that aren't reconciling, you can bucket some of those items into, okay, well, look, we can move past this one versus no, we really need to dig into that one and try to address it.
Excellent, thank you. I know we started a few minutes late, but time is pressing on. So I just wondered, Abby, if we have any questions from the audience.
I am checking, let's see.
Thank you.
Okay, yep, we do have one. The question is, do I need to hire an internal support resource before selecting and implementing a software solution?
Interesting question. James, you've got a view on that?
Yeah, I'll take that. I would recommend that if you don't have a resource within your organization who has experience with implementing software, and I don't mean necessarily literally implementing it and turning the knobs and dials in the application, but being part of the project, being a leader within that project team. If you don't have that experience, I think you need to find somebody who's going to help you. Now, whether or not it's an internal hire versus an external consultant is up to you as an individual organization and what your goals are. Meaning that if you want somebody to be a champion of that software product long term, then I think it would make sense to try to find somebody to bring internal. It will certainly be more cost effective for you on a long term basis. However, if you don't necessarily think you need somebody on a long-term basis, it'll probably be more cost-effective and efficient to have somebody who has years of experience doing this, sort of parachute in, spend the 6 months to 12 months helping you, and then they can move on. So it's really an individual decision, but absolutely you need somebody. In our opinion, working directly with the vendor only is a fine approach, and many people have done it. But you as a leader of the organization need to then sink your teeth into this and be hands-on throughout the entire process.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The strongest implementations in terms of on-time and on-budget delivery are the ones where the client has that internal resource, whether it pre-existed or they brought it in specifically for the project. Proceed with caution, if not.
For sure.
And if we have time for one more question, there's a very timely one here. It's, does the current remote working environment due to COVID delay or complicate system selection and implementation?
Well, if I speak to FundCount's experience, we saw our sales drop off a cliff at the start of 2020, and by the half year, we'd actually hit our year-end target. So what we've seen, and indeed with our implementations as well, everything is speeding up. We've seen a huge pickup in activity in the States and North America, and an even bigger one across APAC. So I actually believe that it's giving people time to look at these issues because, for example, they're not spending time traveling as they might have been. So there's extra resource available there, and that's having a positive impact in terms of both implementing systems and in deciding which systems to use. I don't know, James, have you seen any impact?
Yeah, so I could talk for hours on this. I think it's a timely question, but I'm going to actually make it very short and sweet. We are moving into a I can't even say the word, digitized global economy. No matter what sector of the economy you're in, we are digitizing what we do. And so I think putting a system like FundCount in is absolutely crucial, and we all recognize it now. And so for us, remote working, it has been a little bit of a speed bump in terms of the work that we do in particular. But it has accelerated people recognizing that they need to move things out of disparate systems and Excel files and put them into one source of truth.
Excellent. Well, I think we've slightly overrun our time, so we'll call it a. On behalf of the audience and FundCount, thank you very much for giving up your time to us today. It's very, very interesting to hear your thoughts. And on behalf of James and myself to the audience, thank you very much for giving up your valuable time to attend this. As I say, it will be available as a recording. There is a short response questionnaire after this. If you'd be so kind as to fill it in, we'd be very grateful. And yes, perhaps the next one, James, should be on how to actually run an implementation. That was great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ashley.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye, James.